We are dealing with an extremely sensitive, albeit provocative, subject. If this question cannot be answered, then the Christian faith cannot be defended. And if the Christian faith cannot be defended, why even bother proclaiming it? And in my second talk, particularly as we deal with the uniqueness of Christ in the religions of the world, I will make a few preliminary comments at that point, because at that juncture we'll be setting him in contradistinction to any other claim that points its way or that espouses as being one amongst many ways that take us to God or to salvation. My first lecture is entitled, as per assignment, The Uniqueness of Christ in History. The uniqueness of Christ in history. You can come to this academically by looking at the New Testament documents and showing how they have withstood the onslaught of critics or any kind of analysis across the centuries. You could look at this from the perspective of the missionary movements and see how it is many parts of the world have been conquered by the message of Christ, and that too would be quite unique. But I would like to look at this from the very person of Christ and try to set that before you in your thinking. Many years ago, as a teenager growing up in India, I remember listening to a song being narrated by one who was well known in the 1960s, a man by the name of Ed Ames. And of course, raised in India, my ears perked up because of the specific nature of the questions he raised in that song, which was chanted quite in an Eastern fashion with the background of music almost provoking some kind of mysticism. And he said this, it is a rather long song, I'll just quote a couple of verses at this point. He said this: "From the canyons of the mind, we wander on and stumble blind, way through the often tangled maze of starless nights and sunless days, hoping for some kind of clue, a road to lead us to the truth, but who will answer? Is our hope in walnut shells, wound round the neck with temple bells, or deep within some cloistered walls where hooded figures pray in shawls, or high upon some dusty shelves, or in the stars, or in ourselves? Who will answer?" And the chorus goes, "If the soul is darkened by a fear it cannot name, if the mind is baffled when the rules don't fit the game, who will answer? Who will answer? Who will answer?" Notice the specific nature of the question. He does not long for some abstraction or some dogma. He's not looking for a set of precepts to adhere to or some system that he can give allegiance to. He is personifying the very source of his answer by saying, who has the right to be the answer to the many questions that are plaguing my mind? And indeed, he raises dozens of them as that song unfolds. The fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, that the name of Christ has been virtually unique and unparalleled in history as the one who claimed in himself to be the locus and the sum and substance of the answer, not just only in what he said or what he taught, but in himself, so that if you remove Christ from the Gospels, there is no gospel message left. He is the central feature of his own message. You have heard these words, I'm sure, but it is most appropriate to use them for a theme such as this, entitled One's Solitary Life. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter's shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things one usually associates with greatness. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave. 19 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the human race and the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the kings that ever reigned have not affected the life of man as much as that one solitary life. I'd like to take the liberty, and please bear with me, to read for you a rather protracted passage. I hesitated to do this, but I think if you stay with the imagination of this writer, you will be as enthralled with it as I was. I lifted it out of a book called The 20th Century Pulpit. And in that is a collation of some of the fine sermons preached in this century. Most of them follow a very straightforward line until you come to a man by the name of Frederick Speakman, who uses his imagination and preaches a whole sermon on an imaginary conversation between Pontius Pilate after he had spelled the death sentence for Christ that he has in turn with one of his servants called Gaius. So here it is in excerpts from a message entitled What Pilate Said One Night. Please listen, it's very, very creative. It suddenly closed in on me, Gaius, the impact of how trapped I was. The proud arm of Rome, with all its boast of justice, was to be but a dirty dagger in the pudgy hands of the priests. I was waiting in the room for him, Gaius, that I used for court, officially enthroned with cloak and guard when they let him in. Well, Gaius, don't smile at this, as you value your jaw. But I've had no peace since the day he walked into my judgment hall. It has been years, Gaius, but these scenes I'll read from the back of my eyelids every night. You've seen Caesar when he was young, inspect the legion. His arrogant manner was childlike compared to the manner of this Nazarene. He didn't have to strut, you see. He walked towards my throne, arms bound with a strident mastery and control that by its very audacity silenced the room for an instant and left me with a trembling and an insane desire to stand up and salute. The clerk began reading the absurd list of charges, the priestly delegation punctuating these with the palm rubbings, the beard strokings, the eye rollings, and the pious gutturals I had learned to ignore. But I more felt it, Gaius, than heard it. I questioned him mechanically. He answered very little, but what he said and the way he said it, it was as if his level gaze had pulled my naked soul right up into my eyes and was probing it there, and a voice kept saying in my ears, "Why, you're on trial, Pilate," and that the man wasn't even listening to the charges. You'd have sworn he'd just come in out of friendly interest to see what was going to happen to me. And the very pressure of his standing there had grown unbearable, Gaius, when a slave rushed in all a tremble, interrupting court, bringing a message from my wife Claudia. She had stabbed at the stylus in that childish way that she has when she is distraught. "Don't judge this amazing man, Pilate," she wrote. "I was haunted in dreams by him this night. Gaius, I tried to free him. From that moment on, I tried, and I'll always think he knew it. I declared him out of my jurisdiction, being a Galilean. But the native King Herod discovered he was born in Judea and sent him right back to me. I then appealed to the crowd that had gathered in the streets, hoping they were his sympathizers. But Caiaphas had stationed agitators to whip up the beasts that cry for blood. And you know how any citizen here loves just after breakfast to cry for another's blood. I had him beaten, Gaius, a thorough barracks room beating. I'm really still not sure why. To appease the crowd, I guess. But do we Romans really need a reason for beatings? That's the code, isn't it, for anything we don't understand? Gaius, it didn't work. The crowd roared like some slavering beast when I brought him back. If only you could have watched him, Gaius. They had thrown some rags of mock purple over his pulped and bleeding shoulders. They had jammed a chaplet of thorns down on his forehead, and it fitted. Gaius, it all fitted. He stood there, watching them from my balcony, flamed from weakness by now, but royal, I tell you, not just pain but pity shining from his eyes. And I kept thinking, this is somehow all monstrous, upside down, that purple Israel, that crown Israel. And somehow these animal noises the crowd is shrieking should be praise. And then Caiaphas played his master stroke on me. He announced there in public that this Jesus claimed a crown and that this was treason to Caesar. And the guards began to glance at one another quickly. And that mob of spineless filth began to shout, "Hail Caesar, hail Caesar." And I knew right then I was beaten. And that's when I gave the order. Gaius, I couldn't look at him. Then I did a childish thing. I called for water, and there on the balcony I washed my hands of that whole affair. Gaius, as they led him away, I did look up, and he turned and looked at me. No smile, no pity. He just glanced at my hands, and I feel the weight of his eyes on them from now on. But you're yawning, Gaius. I've kept you up, and the fact of the matter is you're in need of rest and some holidays. Claudia will be asleep by now. Rows of lighted lamps line her couch. She can't sleep in the dark anymore, not since that afternoon. You see, Gaius, the sun went down when my guards executed him. Yes, that's what I said. I don't know how or what. I only know I was there, and though it was the middle of the day, it turned as black as the tunnels of hell in that miserable city, while I tried to compose Claudia and explain how I'd been trapped, and she railed at me with her dream. She's had that dream ever since, when she sleeps in the dark, some form of it, that there was to be a new Caesar, and that I killed him. Oh, we've been to Egypt to their seers and magicians. We've listened by the hours to the oracles of the musty temples of Greece chattering their inanities. We've called it an oriental curse that we're under, and we've tried to break it 1,000 ways, but there's no breaking it. But you know why I keep going, Gaius? Deeper than the curse is the haunting, driving certainty that he's still somewhere near, that I've unfinished business with him, that now and then as I walk by the lake he's following me. And much as that strikes terror, I wonder if that isn't the only hope. You see, Gaius, if I could walk up to him and this time salute and tell him I know now, whoever he is, he was the only man worth the name in all Judea that day. Tell him I know I wasn't trapped, that I trapped myself. Tell him here's one Roman who really wishes he were Caesar. I believe that would do it. Don't you think so? I believe he'd listen and know that I meant it. And at last I'd see him smile. Yes, quiet tonight, Gaius, isn't it? Not a breeze stirring by the lake. Good night. You'd better run along. No. I think will you waken my slave outside the door and tell him to bring me a cloak, my heavy one, please. I'll walk by the lake. Yes, it's dark out there, Gaius, but I won't be alone. I guess I never really have been alone. Yes, good night, Gaius. Powerful use of imagination, interwoven with the specific biblical narrative of what really happened when he was handed over. But the line I like there is that his haunting specter still remains, and the writer is writing in the 20th century pulpit, 20 centuries later. Critics have not been able to obliterate him. Contrary views have not been able to smother him. And somehow, within the deepest recesses of the human heart, for millions of people in this world, the name of Jesus Christ still brings the concept of hope and the reality that there must be somebody out there who put my 2 feet on this earth and with a reason to give me some hope. I believe it was James Stewart, the great Scottish divine, who put it in these words in a marvelous passage. He said this about Jesus: he was the meekest and lowliest of all the sons of men, yet he spoke of coming on the clouds of heaven with the glory of God. He was so austere that evil spirits and demons cried out in terror at his coming, yet he was so genial and winsome and approachable that the children loved to play with him and the little ones nestled in his arms. His presence at the innocent gaiety of a village wedding was like the presence of sunshine. No one was half as kind or compassionate to sinners, yet no one ever spoke such redress, heart-scorching words against sin. A bruised reed he would not break. His whole life was love. Yet on one occasion he demanded of the Pharisees how they were expected to escape the damnation of hell. He was a dreamer of dreams and a seer of visions, yet for sheer stark realism he has all of our self-styled realists soundly beaten. He was the servant of all, washing the disciples' feet, yet masterfully he strode into the temple, and the money changers and hucksters fell over one another in their mad rush to get away from the fires they saw blazing in his eyes. He saved others, yet at the last himself he did not save. There is nothing in history like the union of contrast which confronts us in the gospel, Sir Stuart. The mystery of Jesus is the mystery of divine personality. What a startling coalescence of contrarieties. So you've listened to the songwriter saying, "Who will answer?" You've heard the anonymous voice crying out about the solitary life. You've heard the imagination haunted that he's still somewhere near. You've heard the theologian utter the fact of this startling blending of contrarieties in our Lord. Now would you listen to a secular voice, the voice of the great historian W.E.H. Lecky in his book, A History of European Morals from Augustus to Charlemagne, published in 1969. Listen to what he says. The character of Jesus has not only been the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive in its practice, and has exerted so deep an influence that it may be truly said that the simple record of 3 short years of active life has done more to regenerate and soften mankind than all of the disquisitions of philosophers and all the exhortations of moralists." End of quote. And the New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce, responding to Lecky's comments, said this: "That is a non-Christian, or at least not distinctively a Christian judgment of one sense in which Jesus is not only a historical figure, but also our eternal contemporary. His influence lives on," says F.F. Bruce. Why is it? What is that uniqueness? How is it that when he ascended into heaven, there were only about 120 people professing allegiance in Palestine that boasted 4 million in population at that time? They were outnumbered 1 to 30,000. What was the uniqueness of that message? May I just define the term in one statement and move to the heart of what I'm going to say to you? The great English professor C.E.M. Joad used to be on the airwaves quite often and used to be asked a lot of questions. And he had a brilliant way of responding to many a question, and he would begin his answer with these words: "It all depends on what you mean by." It all depends on what you mean by. So when we look at the theme, the uniqueness of Christ in history, let's ask the question, it all depends on what you mean by the uniqueness. Does it mean that there is nothing in Christ or his message that you will find anywhere else in some fragmentary form? No. But it does mean that in him there is such a consummate expression of God, and in his message is the totality of the expression of what we need for salvation and life. Listen now, please. So that anything that contradicts it becomes untrue by definition of the fact that he claimed to be the truth. So either he is false or that which contradicts him is false. You understand what I'm saying? There may be hints of truth and ideas that are in other systems, but the consummate expression in Christ is so geared towards truthfulness in an absolute sense, so that anything that contradicts it, ipso facto, becomes false. And that I'll be glad to sustain even in the panel discussion. But as I look at the uniqueness, I want to give you 5 ways in which Jesus is unique. And I'll race through the latter part as I spend more time on the first. First is his eternal perspective. His eternal perspective. The Bible says, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given." The son is not born. The child is born. The son is given because the son eternally existed. He prays in his high priestly prayer, "Restore to me the glory, Father, that I had in your presence before this world was made." His eternal perspective and his eternal existence. The Apostle Paul says, "Who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, took upon himself the form of a servant," which means he pre-existed the form that was presented in his earthly manifestation. He is the only creature in existence as part of the Godhead, the reason for whose existence is in himself. When I was filling out my doctoral examination at the graduate school that I studied in Chicago, Illinois, I was sent the questionnaire, and the first question said this: "God is perfect, explain." God is perfect, explain. And I turned to my wife and said, the only more difficult question I can think of is to say, define God and give 2 examples. God is perfect. Explain. How do you find an analogy for perfection? And thankfully, the space given to answer the question was yay small. Because I have no doubt whatsoever that the longer the answer, the greater the possibility of heresy. And so I gave that very simple one-liner that I gave to you earlier on. He is the only being in existence, God is, The only being in existence, the reason for whose existence is in himself. Every other creature looks for the reason of its existence outside of itself. We are all contingent, caused, and finite. God alone is infinite, uncaused, and has the reason for his existence in himself. Eternity. But doesn't it blow your mind? Listening to my brother Lou Alberts, talking about going back and back and back till you move to 1 in 10 to the power of minus 46 or 47. Such abstractions we go to and then say, we got to stop here because we cannot pull the veil beyond that within the finitude of our own minds. You know, we lisp about our world. We lisp about the universe because we can never quite come through with a pointed answer. How can we, who are locked into time and space, ever talk in terms transcending time and space? And that's what Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, said, talking about the categories in which we understand reality. We are locked into the categories of time and space. But that's not too bad. You know, we use words where we actually invoke the opposite in order to prove the idea. For example, when we use the word nothing, try to picture nothing. Can you picture nothing? While you're using something to picture nothing, do you hear a sound that's going ooh in the background, defining nothing? It is no thing, so we talk about a thing in order to posit its absence. That's why somebody said to Aristotle, how do you define nothing? He said, it is that which rocks dream about. How do you define eternity? How do you define eternity? When he looks at his questioners and says, before Abraham was, I am. An eternal being. What does that do for us in looking at his uniqueness? The first thing it does is it points to the reality of heaven, which is the heart's deepest longing. It points to the reality of heaven, which is the heart's deepest longing. One of the most bizarre, and if you allow me to use the term, logically silly, and I'm being very kind, logically silly movies ever to come onto the screens was Nikos Kazantzakis' book, put on the screen form, The Last Temptation of Christ. And Nikos Kazantzakis got into problems in his own theology. And he talked about in his book where Jesus is hanging on, I haven't seen the movie, in his book he talks about how Jesus is hanging on the cross and dying. And when he's paying the penalty for his message, he thinks to himself, you know, I guess I should have been a little kinder and not stuck to the truth in such an exclusive sense. Look what I've given up. I've given up a home that I could have had in Bethany. I could have been married to Mary or Martha and supposedly dreams and some physical relationships with them. Can you believe that somebody whose home was heaven and glory is regretting that he lost his shack in Bethany? It really doesn't make sense, does it? Who thought it not robbery to be equal with God, the eternal I am, who came into this tiny little world created by his own utterance, as it were, who could talk to us of the glories of heaven. One day I am longing to listen to a whole sermon on heaven. I don't have the capacity to give it the analogies. So I'm borrowing a paragraph from C.S. Lewis, who talks about heaven in one of his writings in his own inimitable way. Listen to it, and listen to it again when you get back in your mind's hearing. Hear it again and again. Listen to what he says about heaven. In speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, which we find in ourselves, even now I feel a certain shyness. I'm almost committing an indecency. I am trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of you. The secret which hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. The secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when in very intimate conversation the mention of heaven becomes imminent, we grow awkward and affect to laugh at ourselves. The secret we cannot hide and cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because it is a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our experience. We cannot hide it because our experience is constantly longing for it. And we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of the name heaven. And Jesus Christ, in his embodiment, points to the glorious heaven which was his home. How unique for someone to come from the glory of heaven and tell you and me, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. And I have told you earthly things, and you do not understand it. How are you going to understand heavenly things? There is no analogy, yet we cannot hide it in our experience. It keeps on suggesting it. But not only does his reality point to the reality of heaven, please notice now, he fuses every moment of history with meaning. If he is transcending over time, if he is the eternal I am, and always is ever present, our eternal contemporary, in the words of F.F. Bruce, then the fact of the matter is he fuses all of time with significance. Let me put that in perspective for you. When you talk to the existentialist lives in the now, living with a passion for the now. That's the existentialist. Give it all the passion you've got and do it now. The song extrapolates the idea of existentialism. If it feels good, do it. Or the hedonist extrapolates it, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So the athlete gets onto the track and runs the 100 meters, knowing he's got the steroids injected in him, hoping nobody will ever find out, because the now is what matters, the glory of the moment. Go out into the night, betray the promises, betray the one to whom you made your promises, indulge in it for the night, because now is all you have. How can it be so wrong when it feels so good? The existentialist lives for the now, and think of the havoc existentialism has created. Jean-Paul Sartre was the existentialist guru in the 60s. His teaching influenced the Ankaleo movement in Cambodia and resulted in the slaughter of millions and millions of people as portrayed in The Killing Fields. Sartrean ethics and Sartrean existentialism provided the worldview for the Ankaleo movement to bring about its slaughter, just as Nietzsche's worldview gave Hitler the liberty to do what he wanted to do. The existentialist lives for the now. The traditionalist looks to the past. The traditionalist looks to the past. Have you ever seen the play Fiddler on the Roof? And you see Tevye coming onto the center stage, and he's giving his little monologue there, talking about how they move from village to village, persecuted. Anatevka's our home. But as they keep moving along, persecuted, tormented, he said, somehow we keep going. Somehow we keep going. And you ask me how? I'll tell you, says he, tradition, tradition, tradition. And if we did not have our traditions, our existence would be as tenuous as a fiddler on the roof. The Hebrew looked to the past. The existentialist lives for the moment. The utopianist looks to the future. Pie in the sky by and by when I die, a la Marxist-type philosophy. And after 70 years of living a lie in Russia, where millions have been obliterated in the name of utopianism, one of the most dastardly and bloody experiments in history, where their own people were being exterminated in some kind of a utopian, classless society in the future that was going to come. So the existentialist lives for the moment, the traditionalist lives for the past, the utopianist looks to the future. You look at Jesus with his band of few disciples at the table. He takes a piece of bread and he breaks it and he says this, as oft as you shall eat of this bread and drink of this cup, now you do proclaim the Lord's death in the past until he come in the future. He fused every moment of history pregnant with meaning that God gives to it. If I were to ask for one sermon that I could have listened to live, it would be tough, wouldn't it? This great trans-temporalization idea, where he transcends the temporariness of past, present, and future and gives it all meaning. But if he could transport me and say, Ravi, I'd like you to listen to one message live as portrayed in the Old and the New Testaments, which one would you take, Ravi? Oh my. I could think of Elijah on Mount Carmel. I could think of Peter at Pentecost. I could think of Paul on Mars Hill. And of course, that sermon of all sermons, the greatest of all, Sermon on the Mount. But I think as I have weeded through, I don't know if I'm in error, but I've latched on to the one I would love to have listened to live. As those two disciples on the Emmaus Road in Acts chapter 24, in Luke 24, are walking by this time, talking despondently of all that went wrong. We had hoped he would have been the deliverer of Israel. And as they're walking, this third personage joins them. They don't know who he is. And he says to them, what are you boys talking about? And they say to him, are you the only one in Israel who does not know what has happened? Ironically, he was the only one in Israel who did know what had happened. And the Bible says that he unfolded the scriptures and showed them all from beginning of the prophets, all that had to come to pass. And they say how their hearts burned within them, so that as the time came to part, they said, I'll buy you your dinner. Would you sit down and continue talking? And in a masterful stroke of the beauty of the Word of God, it wasn't some great exposition at that moment, but when he simply took that piece of bread and broke it, their eyes were suddenly opened, and they saw the entire panorama of history through the eyes of the Eternal One. In my office in Atlanta, I have these words penned in, and someone has put it on a parchment, on a frame, and it says this: Jesus Christ continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive, and he compels us to radically redefine what we mean by life. He encounters us the way he encounters the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. Those who had survived him were really the dead. He, the dead one, was really the living. He continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive. The American football coach Lou Little, using the word football the way they use it in America, for the sport they play there. He was a college football coach, one of the greatest. Talks of the time that one of the young men on his team was an outstanding young man in character, but never quite made it to the front, to the top spot. He was always a backup, a bench warmer as they called him, a great young man. And Lou Little says, many times I'd see this young man walking his father through the college property. His father's arm would be in his son's, and the son would be talking to him about the buildings or explaining some piece of architecture or painting. And he said they seemed to be so close as dad and son that I never quite got to the point of introducing myself and breaking up that closeness. Until one day I got a call from his mother saying, Coach Little, my son admires you an awful lot. He feels very close to you. His father has just died a few moments ago. Will you please help my boy get his plane ticket, put him on the plane, and send him back for the funeral? Coach Little did that. On the day of the game, the young man flew back. He said, Coach, I want you to do something. Would you please do this for me? I want to play the game tonight. I know I'm not the first stringer, but I want to play the game tonight. Coach said, I can't let you. He said, but I tell you what, if you play better than the man whom you're replacing, I'll leave you in there. If you're not playing as well, I'll have to take you out. He said, that's fine. He went and played, and by far was the star of the game, gave it an effort and a half. And when it was over, the coach put his arm around this young man's shoulder and said, I know what's happened. You played that for your dad, didn't you? He said, yes, Coach, but I want to tell you something. My dad was born blind. And this was the first time he was going to watch me play. I grant it, there's a sentimentality there. I grant it, you won't base a doctrine on that story because it has a romantic, imaginative touch to it. Let me tell you something. He, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, and made himself of no reputation and came and dwelt among us. There was nothing romantic about him when he talked about heaven. He knew its stark reality, albeit fused with the glory of the romantic love and the beauty of being in the presence of God himself. His eternal perspective. Secondly, his internal imperative. His internal imperative. He did not come to set up a political power that would rule and constrain from without. He came to touch the hearts of men and women that would bring the imperative from within. And what a world of difference that is. Jesus did not come to set up some political structure in this world. Politics swings from one end to the other, and political ideas almost become like that drunken man moving from one wall to the other, knocking itself senseless with every hit. And almost correct, maybe ideologically, was the Hegelian doctrine of how each idea which forms a thesis sooner or later spawns its antithesis, and somewhere they meet in the future to form a synthesis. But moving from one wall to the other, knocking itself senseless is what I'm talking about. He did not come to change humanity by establishing an earthly government or some political strategy. You see, politics inevitably moves towards power. Politics inevitably moves towards power. And Lord Acton has rightly said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He came instead to touch your heart and to touch mine. And that's why Napoleon said it. Napoleon said it well. He said, Alexander's kingdom and my kingdom will ultimately come to naught, but Jesus' kingdom is indestructible, because ours was dominated by power and force. He's dominated the lives of people with the power of love. He changes us from within, that divine, that internal imperative that we talk about. C.S. Lewis describes his conversion in these words: I had always wanted above all things not to be interfered with. I had wanted to call my soul my own. I had been far more anxious to avoid suffering than to achieve delight. I had always aimed at limited liabilities. You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, relenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. I did not see then what I see now, the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet, but who can duly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who's brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance to escape? The words compelle intrare, compel them to come in, have been so abused by wicked men that we shudder at them. But properly understood, they plumb the depths of divine mercy. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation. And if you keep reading on in his book, Surprised by Joy, he says there was no pressure as he rode in that bus that day, just that gentle tug, this is right, this is the right way to go. You know, Jesus could have yielded to political temptation. When the devil said to him, turn these stones into bread and they'll follow you, he said no. The marvelous thing about him was he did not want to draw people by feeding some earthly appetite of theirs. Every leader sooner or later finds out that self-centered appetites are insatiable. You can never satisfy the one who wants more and more and more bread and the things of this world. He works from within. Billy Graham tells the story of a man who had lost his life in alcoholism, a medical doctor who marvelously came to know Christ. And one day when he was sitting in his doctor's office, a friend came to him and he said, let me ask you something. Please tell me. I'm trying to explain what's happened to you, trying to explain it away as a fellow medical colleague of yours. Tell me something. We're all trying to understand you. What's happened? Is it a psychological uplift you've received? What is this? And you can answer it by telling me this. I know how you were hooked on the habit of liquor. Tell me, if you were to come back to your home, to your office some afternoon after a miserable day of all that's gone wrong, and you shut that door, and you know you're alone, and nobody is there with you, are you telling me with that finest bottle tucked away behind your medical journals, if you had one, you're not going to reach out and take that drink once more, even though it'll bring back all the memories of the past? and your enslavement. Are you telling me, with a miserable day, locked behind closed doors, nobody with you, you're alone, you wouldn't yield to that? He said, no, every contingency you've given can at some time properly happen except one. Since I have come to know Christ, I have found out I am never, ever alone. I came to know Christ on a bed of suicide as a teenager in Delhi. All the religiosity from without had done nothing from me. All the power my dad wielded in the political arena had only alienated me because I was no longer important to him. I say that kindly because God marvelously changed his life down the line too. But I just want you to know this, how he entered a hospital room and touched the heart of a young man with the gentleness and a wideness of his mercy, just as he's done for many of you here. You know what it is not to be compelled from without, but to have that internal imperative from within. Will Durant says this in his book, there is no greater drama in history, in the historical record, than the sight of a few Christians scorned or in some way beaten by a succession of emperors, bearing all trials with a fierce tenacity, multiplying quietly, building order while their enemies generated chaos, fighting the sword with the word, brutality with hope, and at last defeating the strongest state that history had ever known. Caesar and Christ had met in the arena, and Christ had won. Durant says this, Christ had won by touching the hearts of his people. So there it is. You have the eternal perspective, the internal imperative, thirdly and quickly, his personal directive. As vast as this world is, and as vast as this world was, Christ had time for the individual. His message is personal in this cosmic scheme of things. In this cosmic scheme of things, I say to you, how marvelous to know that he has time for you and me personally. We heard statistics earlier on, billions and billions and billions. Numbers that stagger the imagination. What is there in man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you have visited him? For when I see the heavens and the work of your hands, the moon and the stars which you have made, what is there in man that you're mindful of him? But yet as he walked through that village with the masses, he got talking to this woman who had been married 5 times, rejected by many people evidently, who was immoral in the sight of society. And in that society, being a woman was even more rejected in her very gender. Her ethnicity was against her. She bore that horrible term called a Samaritan, which was a scourge in that time, despised by the so-called pure. There she was, morally, in her femininity, in her ethnicity, all of those rejections. And she runs back to her village and she says this, you'll never believe what happened. I have met somebody who knew everything about me and didn't hang me up by a cord, is what she's trying to say. I have to think of a comment made by a great professor of one of the major religions in the world. The professor is teaching in California. When a death sentence was passed on a man for writing a book against this, that seemed to mock that religion, a very foolish thing to have done, gets nobody anywhere. But you know this story, how the death sentence was passed on him by the Ayatollah. And it was interesting to listen to a newspaperman or Ted Koppel, the Nightline, say to this professor, tell me, how can you pass the death sentence on an individual like that? All right, he's been blasphemous and wrong, but you really want to take such vengeance into your own hands? And the man looked at Mr. Koppel and said, sir, in what I believe and what we believe, I don't know if he's representing all of them, but this is what he said. The individual is dispensable. It is the system that has to survive. The message has to go on. The individual is dispensable. I couldn't help but think of the parable of Jesus, where the shepherd left the 99 going looking for the one, because the individual was not dispensable. The story is told of an American politician who was talking about the victimization of some people, a minority class. And one day a young teenager from the minority class came to him because he knew this man was giving speeches creating bumper stickers, writing placards on the needs and the rights of the minority. And so this young teenager went and met up with the politician's secretary at the door and said, "Can I go and see him for just 1 minute, please? I need 1 moment of his time. He's delivering a great speech today." And the secretary went to his boss and he says, "There's a teenager, he wants just a few moments of your time." The politician said, "Tell him I have got so involved in his cause, I don't have time for the individual anymore." And the secretary paused and said, "That is incredible, sir. Even God has not come to that stage yet." Isn't it nice to know in the macrocosmic entities of this world, He has the particularity of your need in mind too, and you can come to Him by prayer and call Him Holy Father, and He hears you and He hears me. His personal directive. So you've got first His eternal perspective, second His internal imperative, thirdly His personal directive, fourthly and quickly His inspirational incentive. His inspirational incentive. How He has been the focal point of musicians and artists for centuries, virtually unparalleled. Virtually unparalleled. That a man by the name of George Frederick Handel, in 24 days, can pen that great masterpiece called the Messiah, so that as he's writing with almost a sense of inspiration, he says, "It is as if I saw the heavens open and God present Himself, and the tears are running down his face, and he's writing the marvelous words and the music to the Hallelujah chorus." And as he talks about it, he says, "I felt as though I had a divine visitation." And after the first performance, one of the nobility looks at him and says, "Mr. Handel," he said, "the people really enjoyed what you have done." And he said, "I'm disappointed. I was hoping they would be better people for what they had just heard." How God has inspired the songwriter, from the Bachs, from the Steiners, from the Mendelssohns to the Handels, and the Wesleys and the Watts, and the marvelous hymn writers, and the converted slave trader John Newton. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. And the young man who went insane and spent so much time in an insane asylum, coming under the influence of John Newton and coming to know the touch of God upon his own life, William Cowper, who co-authored a book of hymns with John Newton, and William Cowper, coming in and out of an insane asylum, writes, "God moves in a mysterious way, His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan His works in vain. God is His own interpreter, and He will make it plain." Think of what Christian music has done across the centuries. Unparalleled, unparalleled in so many languages of the world. You know what it does? It does two things. It has not only bridged the imagination with eternal values, but it binds our emotion and stirs affection across linguistic and cultural barriers. Here are the two things broken down. First, it knits your heart with your fellow believer in many parts of the world where you don't even understand the language. One great evangelist, whom I shall leave unnamed, had one of his team members years ago walking on the streets of Romania. And as he was walking by, looking at this desolate country as a visitor, incognito, as he was walking, I think somewhere in the streets of Bucharest, he heard a man walk by on a cold wintry day whistling a tune. And it wasn't a common tune. It was from this hymn, "The Great Physician Now Is Here, the Sympathizing Jesus." And this man paused, looked at him, walked by him, and started to whistle the tune along with him. They looked at each other, couldn't speak. Then the Romanian points to the heavens and then touches his heart. This American points to the heaven and touches his heart too, and they both lock each other in embrace. The gift of music transcending mere verbiage. The uniqueness that God has given in this inspirational incentive. But not only that, it talks about the joy that comes into our hearts at the loneliest times in our lives. I recall 3 years ago being in China, in the town of Shanghai, visiting that aged evangelist Wang Mingdao, who died very recently. Wang Mingdao hit the church news many years ago because when Mao Zedong took over, he put Wang Mingdao into prison in Beijing, and he was suffering greatly. He suffered so much that Wang Mingdao denied the name of his Lord, and so Mao Zedong released him. But after he was released, he was so gnawed by sadness and by remorse. He walked through the streets of Beijing shouting at the top of his voice, my name is Peter, I've denied my Lord. My name is Peter, I've denied my Lord. Mao Zedong had him arrested again and put him behind prison bars for over 20 years. After he'd been released, I had the privilege of being with him in his tiny little room in Shanghai. Along with another evangelist, we were there. And as we sat there, this man with his head thrown back, hands gnarled, mouth unable to close, his tongue was not easily controllable due to some deformity he had developed over the years. His wife completely blind, and some young men sitting at their feet listening to our conversation. And all of a sudden, before I left, he said, would you mind if I sing for you the song that I sang in prison every day? So that first the guards hated it, then they began to tolerate it, then they loved it and were disappointed if I didn't sing it. And he sang all the way, my Savior leads me, what have I to ask beside? Can I doubt his tender mercy, who through life has been my guide? Heavenly peace, divinest comfort, here by grace with him to dwell. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. I can never listen to that song again without listening to it in a Chinese accent. The inspirational incentive. I don't have time to tie this thought together with a marvelous quote from G.K. Chesterton, who talks about why Jesus never laughed on earth that is recorded. And he says, I think there was a certain shyness. And he says one of the things that he maybe hid from us was his mirth, an eternal mirth that there is no analogy for in her earth again. He wept. He was sad at times, but the laughter has no parallel. The laughter of heaven has nothing like that on earth alone. But we've seen his eternal perspective, his internal imperative, his personal directive, his inspirational incentive, and lastly, his incarnational distinctive. His incarnational distinctive as the Word became flesh and dwelt among us full of grace and truth. What we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is the embodiment, God becoming flesh, giving this body dignity, so that I don't have to be like a Gnostic thinking matter is evil, nor do I be like the hedonist who indulges without restraint. Now I know this body is the temple of the living God, and consummating in that monogamous heterosexual union the marvelous gift that God has given to us in marriage, the consummate physical expression that points to a greater spiritual reality. For we now are his bride, and he is the bridegroom. But God in the flesh giving the body a dignity, so that when we are raised again, it is a glorified body. And while he himself takes that body, it is not essentially evil. He shows us how to live in this mortal frame. Victor Hugo said, the world was made for the body for the soul, and the soul for God. I had requested from Dennis House if I had 5 extra minutes. I've taken it, so I close now with this quote and end it. We've talked about the uniqueness of Christ in history, his eternal perspective, his internal imperative, his personal directive, his inspirational incentive, and his incarnational distinctive. It is my favorite quote, and most in order to use it here. It is so unique. It comes from the mouth of Malcolm Muggeridge, who had traversed the world as a peripatetic journalist interviewing the best and the worst of them. He says this, we look back upon history and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, revolutions and counter-revolutions, wealth accumulated and wealth dispersed. Shakespeare has spoken of the rise and fall of great ones that ebb and flow with the moon. I look back upon my own fellow countrymen, once upon a time dominating a quarter of the world, most of them convinced in the words of what is still a popular song, that the God who made the mighty shall make them mightier yet. I've heard a crazed-cracked Austrian announce to the world the establishment of a Reich that would last 1,000 years. I've seen an Italian clown saying he was going to stop and restart the calendar with his own ascension to power. I've met a murderous Georgian brigand in the Kremlin, acclaimed by the intellectual elite of the world as a wiser than Solomon, more humane than Marcus Aurelius, more enlightened than Ashoka. I have seen America wealthier and in terms of military weaponry more powerful than the rest of the world put together, so that had the American people so desired, they could have outdone a Caesar or an Alexander in the range and scale of their conquest. All in one lifetime, all gone. Gone with the wind. England, part of a tiny island off the coast of Europe, threatened with dismemberment and even bankruptcy. Hitler and Mussolini dead, remembered only in infamy. Stalin, a forbidden name in the regime he helped found and dominate for some 3 decades. America haunted by fears of running out of those precious fluids that keeps our motorways roaring and the smog settling, with troubled memories of a disastrous campaign in Vietnam and the victories of the Don Quixotes of the media as they charged the windmills of Watergate. All in one lifetime, gone. Said behind the debris of these self-styled solemn supermen and imperial diplomatists stands the gigantic figure of one person, because of whom, by whom, in whom, and through whom mankind might still have hope, the person of Jesus Christ. Yes, there were many who tried to be, many men who tried to be God, but only the one true God who was willing to become man. And in his uniqueness, he gives us the heavenly perspective on history. May God bless you. Thank you for your patience.